Hello. Good afternoon. My name is John Herbst. I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all very much for coming today. We've got a wonderful program for you focused on an extremely important issue that has not received sufficient attention, at least in the West. I think it's received a fair amount of attention here in Ukraine. And that is the internally displaced people who are internally displaced because of Kremlin aggression in Donbass. I would like to thank today the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center for hosting us here. I would like to thank the Rinat Akhmetov Foundation for supporting this event. I need to tell you that we will have a short video from Alexander Hug to start off the program after I speak. And after that, we will have Neal Walker, who I think well known to this group, for his wonderful work for the UN and on this issue, who will provide a keynote address, after which we will have a panel. One last point I'd like to make,
ladies and gentlemen,
at least a little bit of substance. The circumstances in Ukraine of the IDPs is not easy. And that's an understatement. But Ukraine as a country, Ukraine as a society, the Ukrainian government have managed thus far, with very little international assistance, to essentially provide for the IDPs. I say essentially, there are clearly problems. And this has been a negative factor in the West's understanding of the depths of the crisis caused by Kremlin aggression. Western politicians, European politicians, European citizens understand that there's a serious crisis in the Middle East because they are inundated with refugees. Ukraine's resilience in dealing with the hardship of its citizens caused by Kremlin war has made it easier for Europe to turn its back on Ukraine in pushing back against Mr. Putin's aggression. And that's a sad irony. And with that, we can listen to Mr. Hug. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to address this forum. Perhaps of all the internally displaced persons we in the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission have met and reported on, two in particular stand out. Raisa and Anna, aged 77 and 82 respectively, now living in Mariupol, still insist on calling the destroyed village of Shirokine home. Raisa, who walks with the aid of crutches, even told me she was prepared to walk the 20 kilometers from Mariupol to Shirokine if necessary. Her crutches, alas, cannot help to avoid the landmines and unexploded ordnance that litter the approaches to her village. Neither can they protect against the daily shelling and shooting the SMM records around Shirokine and other areas east and northeast of Mariupol. Too often people like Raisa and Anna are forgotten. The report by the Atlantic Council, I hope, will ensure they are not forgotten. I was in particular heartened by one key message contained in the report, a message that is often lost in the debate on internally displaced persons. IDPs have problems, but they are not the problem. They are in fact potentially the solution to the wider problems that have caused displacement in the first place. The example set by many internally displaced persons and people in host communities all across Ukraine should not be overlooked. Our monitors have over the past few years noted the process of integration, not without challenges sometimes, and this we have reported on too. We have noted from Lviv to Kharkiv people who have many needs and equally much to offer. In general, coexistence, tolerance, and shared responsibilities and entitlements are not abstract for those involved, for neither hosts nor arrivals. Our monitors have also noted some degree of return among IDPs, though not without problems, namely access to their property, their social entitlements, and security. Security is paramount. So long as the sides continue to violate the ceasefire, no one is safe. Already this year, the OSCE SMM has confirmed over 400 civilians killed or injured in eastern Ukraine. The sides have already agreed to ceasefire and to take the measures necessary to ensure that the ceasefire holds, namely the withdrawal of heavy weapons, disengagement of forces and hardware, and demining. In tandem with, not subsequent to, these measures designed to provide security, property rights and social welfare entitlements to all Ukrainian citizens, regardless of where they live, must also be ensured. The conflict has already produced many casualties. It is important now that social cohesion and reconciliation are not added to the casualty list. Additional causes for division, acrimony, and resentment need to be avoided. Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately, internally displaced persons and host communities, in the examples that have given us of dialogue, respect and tolerance, can provide a way out of this conflict. We must, however, also recognize that how internally displaced persons are treated may also be the cause for unduly prolonging or even exacerbating this conflict. All internally displaced persons, including Anna and Raisa, must be able to make a free choice. They must, if they decide, be able to return home. They must be part of the process of rebuilding both their homes and their country. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. And yes, we will start discussion soon, but first we have a keynote speaker. And after that, I will invite all the panelists on the stage to talk about the report, but also in general terms about the crisis that we're dealing with. Please.
Ambassador Herbst, Governor Tuka, it's a pleasure. Welcome, everybody. It's a real honor to be invited here today for this important conference, and I appreciate the opportunity to actually provide the keynote address. There are 1.6 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. This is the 9th largest number of IDPs in any country in the world. In addition, we know that a significant number of these civilians are actually in NGCA, but crossing back and forth all of the time. They do this to claim social benefits, they do this to maintain linkages with their families, and they feel the need to be able to go back and forth. As many as 1 million crossings every single month testify to the fact that Ukrainians on either side of the contact line truly feel that this is one country. By now, Ukrainian people have been displaced for almost 4 years. By anyone's definition, this is clearly a protracted crisis, a protracted displacement. One of the most important conclusions that we can put forward here today, and this is also clearly highlighted in the Atlantic Council's report, is that we must protect the rights of these people to effectively integrate wherever they are, as well as protect their rights to return should they so choose to do so. This really sounds simple. It sounds really logical. It sounds like, of course, yeah, that's logical, and we agree with this. But it just isn't that simple as I see it. And I think that this agenda that you've organized for today is actually quite good at addressing some of the elements as to why it's not so simple to do that. But I just wanted to address some of them from my perspective. What are the challenges as I see them? And you will see that actually in a number of the panels you're talking about this in more detail, but just to highlight some of them. First, though, before the challenges, to let me highlight that Ukraine is not alone. There is an extraordinary and very explicit global agenda to implement better approaches to the problem of protracted displacement. This was one of the major conclusions that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit in May of 2016. Since then, there was a major study on the issue which was carried out and recently published by Professor Walter Kalin called Breaking the Impasse and Reducing Protracted Displacement as a Collective Outcome. Ukraine was one of several case studies in this amongst Somalia and Colombia, maybe the Philippines, as well as Ukraine. And the research that came out of that study, that really intensive study, has helped us to sharpen the debate around what are the problems and what should be done about it. I would also highlight that the recent publication by the Atlantic Council has also contributed to that discussion. This is what is really exciting about today's event. I think most of us in this room would agree that Ukraine can actually serve as a model on how to best address the situations of protracted displacement. There are enormous challenges, but there is also an opportunity here that, from my perspective, doesn't actually exist equally in the other kinds of countries where I have worked. But success will not happen by itself, and there are challenges, and we need to address those challenges. So I'm just going to go quickly through four of them as I see them. First, leadership with a whole of government approach. Government leadership is critical. We have it in some places, and actually Deputy Minister Tuka is one of them. We have it in other places of government, but we don't have it consistently, and we don't have what we really need. But here's something really, really concrete. We can say, let us get the approval of the strategy of integration for IDPs. Let us get it approved. But let's not stop there. Let's actually get the government to fund it. Okay, let's actually give the Ministry of Temporarily Occupied Territories the authority to implement the strategy. And in particular, the ministry must be empowered to effectively work with and coordinate all relevant ministries as well as local authorities to advance solutions for IDPs. This is element number one. It's critical. We thought we had the strategy approved. It seemed we didn't actually. So we also need to, this is the second one, but this is I'm going to give the translators a challenge here. We also need to have a whole of government approach in the key countries that actually are supporting Ukraine. And what I want to say in my neighborhood, we say, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. And I'm honestly not really sure how the translators will translate that. But fundamentally, in Europe and the USA, which are critical supporting parts of the world for Ukraine, we would like to encourage a coherent support amongst three lines within each of these governments, which are sometimes at odds with one another. Of course, there's the support for the national defense of Ukraine. There's support for the humanitarian action that's necessary to reach citizens in need. And then there's finally support for effective reform and development. Now, it shouldn't be that these three are necessarily in conflict, but in fact we see sometimes contradicting messages and tensions between them that actually does not help Ukraine to achieve what it needs to achieve. So what we would like to suggest is that within these countries, just as we have asked Ukraine to take a whole of government approach, we ask these critical support partners to take a whole of Ukraine approach and look at how they make coherent messages and eliminate any possible tensions between these different lines of actions. Third, we need a much greater awareness that IDPs are simply Ukrainian citizens and that they have the same rights as everybody else. This comes out in the Atlantic Council's report. It also comes out incredibly clear in an event which I will attend in just a short while, the launch of the use, the SCORE exercise that's been carried out over the past 6 months with intensive investigation and research across all of Ukraine. What they have found there is that actually people in eastern Ukraine do not distinguish. More people do not distinguish between IDPs and people who are not IDPs than in the rest of Ukraine. Isn't that interesting? So it's right where the conflict is most intense that people actually say, we're one here. Why are we fighting? Why are we being separated? So generating this greater awareness throughout the country that IDPs are citizens the same as anybody else is really critical. Interestingly, as we look at the context of this, as we look at the history of this, we understand that worldwide, the internally displaced person classification was created, in fact, to facilitate actions in response to the vulnerabilities that IDPs face. Unfortunately, here, but also elsewhere in the world, it actually serves only to isolate IDPs. It becomes a long-term label. Oh, you're an IDP. Oh, you're an IDP. It's a stigma. It's a barrier for actually their integration and well-being. We know there are very specific actions that the government needs to take in order to reduce that. I mean, allowing people to register to vote wherever they are is a simple example. Delinking the payments of pensions and social assistance from the issue of IDP status. These are actually, this delinking of the payments of pensions is actually required under Ukrainian law. It would be required under international humanitarian law, but we don't even have to quote international humanitarian law. We can simply speak about the national law and the decisions of the Supreme Court in Ukraine that these payments must be made. It's actually really distressing, especially for those of us who are approaching pensioner age, to think that you could work all your life, you could have your pension all set up, and then suddenly they'd say, well, you're a so-and-so person, and you're not going to get it. That's really, this is very personal for me. But we would like to say that we believe that the Ukrainian state can move away from the stigma that is associated with IDPs. They can move away from the wrong decrees. They can move away from the wrong legislation and from the wrong policies. There are clear indications that there are parts of government that want to do this. There are parts that are trying to do it, but unfortunately they haven't succeeded, at least as far as the right to vote, as far as the right to payments of pensions. So this is, we really want to emphasize this one. IDPs are simply Ukrainian citizens, the same as anybody else. And the more we can do to generate that awareness, the better. Fourth is that humanitarian and development actors must work hand in hand to achieve sustainable outcomes. I'm really proud of the work that the United Nations team in Eastern Ukraine is doing on this. Already together, we're working on developing innovative approaches to meet both humanitarian needs and linking it to development work. I need to say, there is humanitarian need in Ukraine. We understand that sometimes Ukrainians don't want to hear this. This is not a country where there's humanitarian aid. We are not the Central African Republic. And it's true that this is not the Central African Republic. It's true that there are much greater resources here to address the kind of humanitarian need that we face than in other places. But it doesn't change the fact that strong evidence supports real humanitarian need in Ukraine. So we want to make sure that on one hand, we shine a light on that humanitarian need, and that we ensure that we're getting both the government support and international support for addressing that humanitarian need. At the same time, we fully agree with the government that anything that we do in terms of humanitarian assistance must be linked to more sustainable programs, creation of jobs, creation of livelihoods, the fixing of social systems such as health and education and welfare, such that we are actually generating for the next generation a different kind of life for these people who have been affected by conflict. So I think these are the main lessons that I wanted to share, or I don't know if they're lessons. I guess they're areas for action in the context that we face here. We need to remember that these figures are incredible, but over the past 4 years, there's more than 200,000 people in eastern Ukraine that have experienced, on average, 47 times every single day, some kind of firefight or some kind of shelling. 57,000 of these are children. We're talking children who over the past 3 or 4 years have experienced shelling, firefights every single day. This is a trauma that is not going to go away. Investments in the social services to help these children, to help these people, is going to be critical. But let's lead with solutions. And here there is an opportunity. I fully agree with one of the main conclusions, I think, of what was the Atlantic Council's report, that IDPs actually hold a critical key to sustainable peace in Ukraine. From my own 3.5 years experience in Ukraine, I have seen the inspirational work of the civil society organizations. And it's my view that the integrated, effective support that we can provide to IDPs, it reinforces that inspiration. It reinforces a sense of Ukrainian pride that we can overcome these kinds of problems. So fundamentally, we need balanced, meaningful support to IDPs that supports host communities as well as IDPs. And this will, I am convinced, this will build momentum for sustainable peace and social cohesion. Finally, there is urgency. It's hard to understand urgency when this problem has been ongoing for 3.5 years. I feel that if I lose my sense of urgency, that I should leave the country. You know, that, oh, well, it's just business as usual. You know, it's an IDP problem. It's a protracted crisis. You know, what else is new? I don't find that acceptable. You know, so I would like to inject as a final comment a sense of urgency around these issues. And I encourage all of you here today, as you work through what is a really exciting agenda, that you look not only for the quality of interventions, for the definition of interventions, but you look for the ways which would facilitate the speed of intervention, the rapidity of actions that would somehow help IDPs. Surely, I think you will generate consensus around timely strategic actions, and I wish you luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was Neal Walker, resident representative of the United Nations Development Program in Ukraine. So now I invite all our panelists on the stage, and I'll do a quick introduction. Have a translation, please? Translation, please. We need translation for the ministry. 2. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we a bit late on time, so let's start. Again, thank you so much for joining the event. My name is Maxim Rustavi. I'm a non-resident research fellow at the Atlantic Council, and I will introduce all the panelists quite shortly after a short introduction. So actually, I'm really personally glad and inspired to be part of this event and to see such a report even coming out. Eastern Ukraine is my homeland. I actually always enjoy traveling there, and more so after 2014, which is not a very kind of a common argument to make, and people don't understand why are you so eager to travel as much as possible there after the conflict started.
But I feel it's important to pay attention to the stories on the ground in this situation, humanitarian situation on the ground, because we, as a European community, probably have no moral chance at all to resolve this issue unless we tackle the issue of people who are either trapped or suffer from this horrible tragedy. All those talks about geopolitical agenda, all those talks of resolving the conflict do not have any sense if you do not see actually the human tragedy that is happening and it is unfolding on the ground. So, but I also feel like traveling there, it's important also for Ukrainians not to make it over conceptual. Being in Eastern Ukraine is also very inspiring. If you meet people on the ground, IDPs or people who suffered from the war, and you see the astounding resilience of those people rebuilding their lives, starting from scratch, not expecting anything from anyone. This is not any of the conflict zones I've seen or heard. And this gives a lot of inspiration for the resolving of the conflict, for the tackling of the issue of Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also for those people who want to address it. At the same time, unfortunately, not the international efforts nor the Ukrainian state live up to the same kind of high standards of dealing with this crisis. There is lack of concerted international effort in ending the war. The issue of humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is unfortunately not a mainstream agenda. When it comes to the Ukrainian state, it is often being accused of treating IDPs and Ukrainian citizens trapped in the occupied territories as a problem and failing to offer them effective means to exercise their constitutional rights, whether it's right to vote or receiving social benefits. And for example, if you ever been to the Stanitsa Luhanska and the bridge that separates two occupied territories in Ukrainian government-controlled territory is an unfortunate illustration of the same situation where people are still risking their lives trying to just access the government-controlled territories to exercise their rights or to get or seek any help or attention. The Atlantic Council's report, Ukraine's internally displaced persons hold a key to peace, is one of the interesting ways to tackle this issue. And it brings more, obviously, a question how to bring more international light to this issue, what we're doing wrong or right, or what is done already, and pointing to the deficit of participation among displaced Eastern Ukrainians in the conflict resolution. So we do not infantilize them and treat them as stakeholders in the process because we're basically talking about their homes and not just a geopolitical issue. I'll start introducing guests by and laying some quick ground rules so it's easier for us to proceed. So first of all, Ambassador John Herbst, who is also director of Eurasia Center at Atlantic Council. We have two authors of the report, Melinda Haring, she's editor UkraineAlert and Atlantic Council as well, and Dr. Lauren van Metre, she's professor at Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, and also Georgiy Tuka, who's Deputy Minister of Ukraine's temporarily occupied territories and IDPs. Well, the rules are very simple. Let's keep our answers and comments within 5 minutes, so we have enough room for everybody to shine through and make their arguments. As well, I'll start offering you opening remarks, 5 minutes. Then I'll have direct questions to each of you on specific topics, and then we will open the floor for Q&A, so everybody has a chance to weigh in. Okay? Great. So I'll start with Ambassador.
I think
or
who do the reports are probably
Thank you
first.
so much. So let's then hear about from the authors of the reports. And, well, let's go for opening statements. Melinda?
Thank you very much. Actually, Maxim asked us to address several questions in our opening remarks, which I would like to do. And it's a little bit of a twist on the idea of IDPs have an important role to play in a peace process. I would also argue that, you know, the war has many dimensions. It has the dimensions of a military conflict with military strategy and operations. It has the dimensions of a geostrategic conflict. But this war is also about perceptions, and it's also about narratives, and it's about information and disinformation. And I think that the story about IDPs has actually a very important role in this perceptual war with Russia. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. You know, there's often the perception that Russia occupied the East and invaded in order to protect the rights of Russian speakers in the East. And we have 1.6 million Ukrainians who fled from that protection. And I think it's important, you know, to highlight the fact that this perceptual war is supported by many of the stories that IDP tells. I think the other issue that comes out as well, and these are from stories that I've had with IDPs through my work for 2 years here in Ukraine, is the issue of social cohesion, that the war was meant to tear at the fabric of Ukrainian society. And yet you see in the discussions with the IDPs that in fact, they are very much at home and in touch with families and friends back in the East at the same time that they are integrating locally in the West. And that has had an amazing identity shift for these Ukrainians who are now bridgers. They bridge both East and West. They have an identity that can translate and cohere Ukrainian society. And I think that's an important story to tell. And the final issue, I think, is a grievance that's often played on by Russia in the East, which is around Kiev and punitive policies against the East. And I think this effort to build a strategic plan for IDPs that focuses on their durable solutions really undercuts and mitigates that perceived grievance. And so I think the IDP story needs to be elevated, and it needs to be elevated in a way that gets at the perceptual dimensions of this conflict. The other area where I think the idea of IDPs can be elevated is around what our keynote speaker said is around protracted conflict. And right now there are 63 million IDPs and refugees worldwide that are in those positions because of protracted conflict. And if the humanitarian world has spent the last decade focused on protection of IDPs and refugees and responsibility to protect, the next decade has to be around durable solutions for IDPs. And I think Ukraine has the ability to be in the forefront of that international effort to resolve a critical global crisis that requires innovative solutions. It requires people that are willing to step up and implement these types of durable and sustained situations for IDPs. And I think one way to elevate Ukraine's IDPs status and attention to IDPs is actually encourage Ukraine to be a leader in this effort.
Thank you. Melinda?
Can you cue up my PowerPoint, please? Oh, there we go. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm one of the authors of the report. I have a very brief time, so I'm going to use it wisely. I want to give you a thumbnail sketch of the situation. I want to explain the main argument. The main thrust of our paper is that we need to do some new thinking about IDPs and tell you 5 stories about ways that IDPs are contributing to the peace process. And then we'll come back to recommendations. We have specific recommendations for the international community, and I'm so grateful that you all turned out today, and then also for the Ukrainian government. So this report that we put together is based on field work. We did field work in Vinnytsia, Kiev, and Severodonetsk. Like everyone has said, there's 1.7 registered IDPs, 1.7 million registered IDPs. It's the 9th largest population in the world. Now, you wouldn't know that if you read an international newspaper. This crisis doesn't get enough play in the news, unfortunately. If you took and that's part of the reason why we're here. We're an American think tank based in Washington, D.C. We think this issue needs far more attention. And we don't think the Ukrainian government is doing enough. We think the approach has been piecemeal, and that there's good efforts being done, and we certainly want to support those efforts. But former Prime Minister Yatsenyuk came to the Atlantic Council last year, and we asked him about it, and he said, the situation is more or less under control. The situation is not under control. It's absolutely not under control. But as Neal Walker says, it's fixable. It's absolutely fixable. So we're here to provide some of those ideas and hopefully generate a dialogue. And as Neal also said, the situation in the non-government controlled territories has really deteriorated. So now is the time to talk about this issue. It needs to be a bigger international, bigger issue within society here as well. So the thrust of our argument is pretty simple. IDPs are war victims. They're due universal human rights. It's not only the right moral thing to do to solve this issue, to take it on, it's also the strategic thing to do. And John Herbst will make this argument in more depth. Now, our report has an intellectual framing, but I'm a journalist, and I think that this issue is won by changing people's hearts. So we found 5 ways that Ukrainians are contributing to the peace process, and I'd like to tell you a few of those stories. Number 1, they're contributing to local economies. This is a small family out in the Carpathian Mountains. They're Crimean Tatars. Before annexation, there were only 20 Crimean Tatars. There are now 200. And this family retrained. They were farmers before they moved, and now they're making cheese, and they have a meat business. They've had more children, and the community's been really welcoming. They'd never seen a Muslim before. They saw his long beard, and they thought he was an Orthodox priest. But the family feels so good in this community. They've had another child. They said, he's not a Crimean Tatar. He's a Carpathian Tatar. So there's beautiful examples, and I think the journalistic community could be doing more to tell these stories as well. Another way that IDPs are contributing to the process is they're advocates for each other. This picture you see is from a play that was done in Vinnytsia about the ordinary lives of 7 women. Mustafa Naim, who is not a woman, who's a parliamentarian, participated in it. Big prominent people are getting behind this play, and it's being shown over the country. And it's a way to illustrate this is about ordinary people's lives and the difficulties that they face. We don't have a picture of this, but in Severodonetsk, a group of locals, it's both IDPs and locals, are getting together and sailing a huge catamaran, which is a sailing boat. Now, it's not easy to sail a catamaran. You have to work together. So that's another great example of local reconciliation and trying to overcome prejudices that we've talked about. This is my favorite example in Donetsk. This is graduation ceremony at National Donetsk University. In July of 2014, the separatists showed up, and armed guards massed. They took over 4 buildings of the university. 9 days later, they took the entire campus. The university is one of 17. It's had to relocate to Vinnytsia. It's keeping those linkages between East and West. It's incredibly important. And the university is flourishing today. My last example, Maxime, and then then I turn it back to you. And then IDPs themselves are advancing the peace process. This woman's name is Irina Stepanova. She's an IDP from Slovyansk. She was a Protestant Christian. Her church was taken over by the separatists, and she had to evacuate. Her children were too close to the violence, and she wanted nothing of it. She's now working for one of the most prominent civil society organizations. So these are 5 real examples of ways that IDPs are contributing now. Thank you.
I want to hear a short opening statement from Minister Tuka, and please.
Добрий день.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation to participate. I'm really glad to attend this platform, and I would like to thank, first of all, to Atlantic Council for their huge support that we get as a ministry from the very start. And so we have huge problem in Ukraine. This is the situation with IDP, but I really believe that government should do more to resolve this problem. Everything started from the first days when IDPs appeared in the cities and villages of Ukraine. Mass media outlets, maybe this was a coincidence, but I paid attention to the fact that in all news dedicated to some criminal events that can happen in any country of the world, in a case when some crime was committed, some IDP committed a crime, they always said about it, they reported about this crime from the site of crime. Consciously or subconsciously, they started to form negative attitude of Ukrainian citizens to their compatriots who unfortunately became IDPs. Then I will try to be objective, and I would like to say that successful integration of IDPs and local communities, this got modest attention. But if some drunk guy said something about Russian world, they continued to send this message through the media, and they formed such an opinion that the IDPs are the separatists, that they came here, and this formed negative attitude of people. And I spoke many times with people who implement policy. From the first days, as a ministry, we have such a position that IDPs should have the right to take part in elections, in local elections. So, for example, people can vote for president, but they cannot vote for a mayor. And the biggest threat that people saw, those who implement policy and who take decisions. So these people, they reflected the position of the media, and how can we provide the right to vote if they vote for the representatives of separatist forces? And now this view, thanks to the work of international organizations and efforts of NGOs, of IDPs, and those and the work that is carried out by the ministry, this position changes. And I hope, maybe not until the end of this year, I do not want to be that optimistic, but maybe in winter or spring, I hope that there will be a draft law that introduces changes, that it will be in the whole of the Supreme Council, and I know that there is support in the Supreme Council, and that people that form the community in which they live, they will have the rights to influence the lives of these communities.
Jumping into specific angles, and as Melinda pointed out about strategic importance of placing the issue of IDPs front and center in conflict resolution, and the right discourse, that it's not there yet. Would you expand on that, please?
Okay. In a sense, I anticipated your question in the remarks I made at the beginning. We have this
Як я вже казав в моїх вступних ремарках, Україна Україна робить важливі кроки, і український уряд, і українське суспільство, щоб зменшити страждання внутрішньопереміщених осіб. Але ще багато лишається зробити. Мінімум вже наданий, мінімум потреб задоволений. І Україна має це робити, адже тоді в іншому разі
International support for Ukraine's efforts to deal with IDPs. I mean, the report helpfully, Melinda and Lauren's report helpfully points out that of the $214 million requested in assistance, only $24 million has been provided. So at the basic level of international support for the suffering IDPs, the response has been highly inadequate. But then also, because especially in the modern West, humanitarian problems have an important geopolitical element. The absence of suffering Ukrainians in Europe has weakened the European response to Kremlin's ongoing aggression in Ukraine. So that's why this report is important, because it's bringing to people's attention the fact that there is this major IDP people in Ukraine. Now, people here in Ukraine don't need to know this. You already know it. But people in the West don't. And so, we rolled out this report in London earlier this month, and we're rolling it out in the States to raise the profile. But obviously, more work needs to be done. The geopolitical context is clear. In Europe, a major power has committed aggression against another European state, changing borders or trying to change borders, and leading to deaths of 10,000 people, leading to untold suffering by over 2 million people who are IDPs or refugees in Russia. And we need to magnify this fact so that, again, we increase the response, produce a better response from the West to deal with this problem. There's one more very important geopolitical fact which has to do with Ukraine itself, without reference to the external world. The absorption of IDPs in Ukraine, again, an effort of the entire society, has been impressive given the relative lack of resources. This has strengthened the resilience of Ukraine as a society. This has weakened, diminished the differences between East and West that have been part of social reality here since independence and before, and has, in effect, strengthened Ukraine as a unitary nation, a unitary society. And that is very important. And that is yet one more reason why the Kremlin's aggression in Donbass will fail.
Thank you. I have a quick question to Lauren. Because you did a lot of field work, actually, and because you have a terrific background in analyzing and doing research on other conflicts, there are a lot of parallels, and this is one of the biggest problems, right, for framing this the problem, because we're dealing not with refugees, we're dealing with IDPs, and they're very good on their own to integrate within Ukrainian society. So for somebody abroad, it seems like not such a big a problem, despite that we're dealing with 2 million people who lost their homes and need to build a life anew. How would you build that bridge for international audience, or make a suggestion to the Ukrainian government as well, how to make that bridge to make sure that the international allies understand the severity of this problem, but also have a useful reference to previous conflicts or ongoing conflicts?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be emphasized when you look at other conflicts like the Georgia-Azerbaijan conflict, or the conflict in Colombia, which themselves have huge numbers of IDPs, is that Ukraine appears to be learning some valuable lessons from this that only strengthen its position in terms of the internally displaced. One of the critical issues in terms of Azerbaijan and Georgia was the politicization of the IDP situation. While they held out the opportunity for both return and for local integration, in fact, really all of the policies in both those countries, Georgia until 2007, were simply about return. And so IDPs were held in collection centers near the border of Abkhazia and Georgia. They were held in Azerbaijan in collection centers as well. There was not support for livelihood issues because why provide an ability to work if the whole objective was to return? And so for generations and even decades, these situations went on with really serious effects that IDPs became dependent on humanitarian aid. They lost their agency and their ability to make a life in their new homes. And it even transcended generations. You have generations now in both of those countries where the children of IDPs still think that their objective is to return and decades later are not putting down roots in those local communities. So the fact that Ukraine and the strategic plan right now are pushing for options to return, options to resettle, and to give IDPs choices in and not politicizing the returns is an extremely positive step forward in terms of its response to the IDP issue. I would also really like to compliment the role of the ministry as well, because I think one of the big lessons coming out of Colombia is the importance of a coordinating ministry. These issues cross many, many different ministries, and the fact that you are already up and starting, not decades in, right now is absolutely critical to the success of IDP.
Well, Minister Tuka has also pointed out a very important issue about the media coverage, right? And I think you've dealt with a lot of human stories, and you saw those people who are real human beings. But the problem is, both with international media and local Ukrainian media, that there is not a lot of coverage of human stories. Therefore, we also talk in very abstract terms about IDPs or переселенцы, and not talking about real human stories. This is something to think for civil society and media. But I wanted to ask Melinda about the thing that I like about this paper and report, and not because affiliation with Atlantic Council, but personally because I've seen so many that, again, deal with concepts and with geopolitics. This one has specific guidelines, or providing at least a preliminary blueprint for the government how to go and act better on this issue. And you have, I think, 5 points from there, right?
I got more than 5, Maxime.
But let's keep it to 5 more important.
Okay, so we have recommendations for the international community and then for the Ukrainian government.
Let's start with the Ukrainian government.
With the Ukrainian government, okay. So the first and most important is to empower this new ministry. They need more staff. They need more Western advisors with technical expertise. They have about 100 staff members, as I understand it, and many of them are from the law enforcement community, and they don't necessarily have the sort of technical expertise to handle all this. So Western governments should be helping to step this up. But just in terms of empowering the ministry, giving it a budget and presidential support is really, really important. That's the most important thing that the government could do. The second is to delink pensions and social payments from IDP registration. If you talk to IDPs, they will tell you that getting these very, very small payments is the biggest pain ever. It takes 3 days every 6 months. So if you want to work, you actually can't go to work. You have to stay home and wait for some government person to come and verify your address. Why? It's crazy. Number 3, and I think this is immoral, 350,000 old people have had their social payments suspended for 1.5 years. It's illegal. Neal explained this very clearly. Parliament can fix this. Let's fix it. we need to give IDPs the right to vote in the next elections. And the last issue that needs to be sorted out, and this is a weakness of our report, we did not talk about housing. And there's a new team of British Ukrainian researchers who've looked into this issue, and they have some very interesting preliminary conclusions. We didn't wade into this, but there's a huge housing shortage, and it's the #1 reason why elderly people are stuck in non-government controlled areas. We believe very strongly that people should be able to choose, but elderly people can't choose because the rents are so expensive.
And actually, the housing issue is probably the most severe here because Kiev, as one of the places where the most IDPs actually came, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people for a city of, 3.5 million. And I personally know stories of people who are forced to leave Kiev and go back to occupied territories just because of the, housing prices that are insane. Yeah, nobody knows. But I wanted to ask Minister Tuka one important question, and it mostly directed to for foreign allies and foreign representatives seen here, because there is a bit of confusion when we're talking about the Ukrainian government. There is obviously undeniable fact that not enough is being done and the situation is not under control. At the same time, when we meet some specific members of the government who have different positions or at least share those concerns with the international community, like yourself, for example, there is a lot of confusion. Why is there no unified position even within the Ukrainian government on this issue? Why it has been so politicized? Because of the elections or because of the other issues? And I really wanted to ask this question you specifically.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for your question. First of all, the question, the matter of IDPs is very politicized. I have already said that there is a point of view not only in the government, let's not demonize the government. In the society, there are many citizens, a big portion of citizens who are very careful, who produce very careful attitude to IDPs. It has been formed for a long period. The parliament, the government is a part of our society, and if the society has people among its members who believe that you are all separatists and let them live on uncontrolled territories, and these members of society are in parliament and in the government because the government is a part of our society. They are not from the moon. So the discussions about the fates of IDPs are rather bold. And now we are approaching final implementation of the pilot project addressing the housing problem in Mariupol and Pervomaisk cities. Minister Chernish and me, we just posted an ultimate that if it is not realized, we will be acting demonstratively. When the newly established ministry was created, we understood that we would be like stick in some ass. Not understanding our mission to this extent, we didn't wait.
Great time. I have one quick follow-up with Lauren, because one important issue that is still not addressed is, and I do really personally hate the term IDP or IDPs because it dehumanizes people we're talking about war displaced people. But the other issue that it has been third year into the Russian invasion, and we're still talking about as if it's one group. One particular issue is related to gender, also age, and also predominantly people who are affected. There are women and children. I want to talk very quickly on this issue and specifically gender-related aspect of it.
Thank you. Yeah, this comes out of our work with in our IDP project, and I think one of the things that was a surprise to us, but which we really took to heart in terms of our programs with IDPs, is that war affects people differently, and war affects men and women differently, and the internally displaced are affected very differently in terms of how men experience the displacement and how women experience the displacement. And I think it's really critical as a national strategy is developed around IDPs that a gender, perspective be incorporated. And by gender, I don't mean just women. I want to be very clear about that, because it was actually the situation with men that most struck us with the situation with IDPs, which is that male IDPs, I call, suffer the trifecta of displacement. Okay, they're displaced from their homes, and often their status, their economic status, is completely lost when they lose their homes. Because that economic status is lost, they tend to lose their status in their homes. They may no longer be the primary breadwinner. Women may take over that role. And then the final issue is they tend to lose status in the community for these issues around discrimination and prejudice, that they, more than women, are often seen as a fifth column or supporters or sympathizers to the conflict in the East. So this displacement is hitting men very, very hard. It's isolating. It is a cause of, in many cases, domestic violence and depression around male displacement. Women are also similarly affected by the displacement, but theirs displacement can be, not in all cases, actually more empowering. They tend to be more welcome to the communities. They tend to integrate more quickly as they take their children to school, go see doctors, etc. So their situation is different. All this to say that any solution to IDPs, any programming, any strategic plan has to recognize the differences around gender, around age, and even regional differences as well.
Great. Well, now I'm opening the floor for questions. If you have one, just raise your hand and state your name, affiliation, and your question. Yep. Please. Yes. Who's providing the mic? Yeah, 1 second.
Romana Melchenko, active civil position AGO, network of IDPs. So a lot of proposals were submitted for the strategy. 95% of all the proposals submitted from NGOs were rejected and was not taken into account. There were some comments about overall situation that were included, but they rejected the issues of restoration of rights, provision of housing, compensation issues, and they didn't take into account the address from our network of 120 organizations, and also the proposals were rejected of GIZ organization and tens of other organizations. I have a question. So the main task of the strategy, the nearest task, is to create a program of adaptation, and it was created by leading institutions with the support of IDP organizations, and this program was adopted in 2015, and it didn't get any financing from the budget, and now it will end. But the main in the strategy is to develop the same program. So maybe we should continue the existing program if it is analogous. So now the old program is nearing the end, and the new strategy is still under development. So this is the question to the minister. Thank you for your question. Your proposal, it has some grounds, but this is like a stillborn child. It doesn't was to resuscitate it. So the program that was started in 2014 and it was adopted in 2015, it resolved short-term issues. It didn't conclude the sustainable development, and this is what makes it different. And according to the regulation of the Cabinet of Ministers, the development of program and the strategy, this should be done by our colleagues from the Ministry of Social Policy. But this work was not done. That's why we undertook an initiative and we developed the strategy. Thank you.
Any more questions, please? Yes.
Hi there, I'm Michael Patriciu. I'm former spokesperson for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, and now I'm independent analyst. Just a quick note, and then I'll get to my question. 2 weeks ago at the Ukrainian World Congress in Toronto, I did remind the diaspora community, which has amazing amount of resources financially, professionally, of their also responsibility to help the IDP problem here, especially topping up the funding of the humanitarian appeal. My question is this, there have been also a lot of professions that have been displaced, journalists, lawyers, health professionals from both Crimea and the East that are now here in Kiev and elsewhere without any opportunity to get jobs or relicensed. And in the case of journalists, they're kind of facing a double whammy because a lot of their former places of work have been destroyed in both government-controlled areas and non-government-controlled areas. And then they come here, and it's very, very difficult for them to get jobs. Do any of you have any possible ideas or solutions of how to get some of these professionals back to work in their professions, possibly even getting them internships, scholarships, or placements abroad?
I think maybe Melinda can actually frame it in terms of economic participation. And we're talking about the region that has been already very high on high-quality workforce. And this is why the majority of those people actually went to big cities, to Kharkiv, to Dnipro, to Kiev, from Eastern Ukrainian urban territories.
I mean, honestly, I've been really surprised when you think IDP, you don't think, so one of the IDPs I know who lives in Kiev helped put together the Donetsk stock market, right? These are high-level people, highly trained, many brilliant people. I heard another example last night, someone who ran the Donetsk airport, right? These are highly trained people with sophisticated skills. Some of them are starting new businesses. I think there's going to be more and more interest, hopefully from some of the international financial institutions, to try to spur some of these retraining programs. And we're doing some thinking internally at the Atlantic Council. I don't have a cute answer for you, but we're doing some thinking at the, within our think tank about how to get that region going again and how to do some of that highly skilled training.
I think that the issue is very combined with, in general, with the reforms when it comes to entrepreneurial programs and so on, because one thing that strikes about war displaced people from Ukraine, no matter what age they are, after 45 or before 45, a lot of them start new businesses, small businesses, and they, because of the previous legacy of 90s, they don't seek state support of any kind. And this is closely related to reforms about small businesses, supporting small business, and so on. We're seeing that in Kiev, but unfortunately in many other cities it's very harder to get.
And the real issue is access to capital, right?
Of course.
That's the issue. If you want to start a small business, you need to have a loan with a decent rate. So, I mean, that'll be certainly part of the recommendations. The Atlantic Council will be doing more work, I hope, John, on this issue and more thinking about this issue.
If you're a war displaced person, you go to bank and you try to get a loan with all this nightmare with papers, and banks are not very open to give you a loan if you're from territories that are occupied.
I wanted to make one other point, if you don't mind, just responding to Mr. Tuka. I take his point that this is not a session just to beat up on the government, and that we need to also look at society as well. And I think that that's a good point. One of the recommendations we came up with, and I think it's my favorite, and one that you'll respond to, Maxime, is there needs to be a very creative campaign. I am an IDP campaign. It needs to be super cool all over the media. You guys are brilliant at making these murals. Tell the world how interesting and smart and diverse IDPs are. Tell the stories. There are so many good stories. Do real journalism and tell people we're Ukrainians.
And yeah.
Дякую за запитання. Звісно,
Thank you for your question. So we are ready to support the analogous initiatives, but it's not a secret that our ministry do not have enough material resources and money. So information policy ministry, they have 29 people, and this is in times of war, and they have 20 million budget, and second place is our ministry, and unfortunately the situation continues. There are a lot of ideas what should be done, but we just try to break the wall with our forehead. But I believe that we should contribute more to important issues. For example, to provide ADPs with right to vote, to introduce changes in housing legislation, and introduction and financing of programs, and 50-50 program, but our deputies didn't provide for financing of this law. And until the end of this year, we wanted to get 1 billion to finance this project, but nothing comes out of it. So it's better maybe to spend these resources for some fundamental changes. Thank you.
Please, yeah.
Natalia Milchenko, coordinator.
Natalia Milchenko, the platform of protection of rights of those who suffered in the result of the conflict in Ukraine. Our platform unites more than 50 organizations throughout Ukraine, and we are a legal foundation of all Ukrainian Union of IDPs. My colleague mentioned about this organization. So we represent the rights of the organizations and IDPs, and we believe that the main problem of IDPs in Ukraine is that the power do not hear the IDPs. I won't repeat the example Roman mentioned, but I want to say that at the Ministry of Occupied Territories and IDPs, they didn't create public council, and we still don't have this, and this is the only executive power body where they do not have such a public council. We use all the opportunities to bring our key messages. Our main message as the representative of organizations of IDPs is that IDPs, these are not only people who were displaced, these are people who suffered from the armed conflict. And we demand that the power recognize this. And in the strategy of integration of IDPs, there is a mention about it, but now there is a question how to implement the rights of people who suffered in the result of the military conflict. This is included in the law. This is in the law of Ukraine on terrorism. And we speak about the necessity to compensate to provide compensation to those people who suffered. So first question about why does the power, they say nothing for us without us. So only what our clients' organizations say, this should be implemented. And the second thing, so the recognition and compensation. So I would like to end the sentence. So our messages of ours are, the main problem is not humanitarian help, but permanent place of residence, not at the level of loans, but provision of social housing to those who are in need, to provide permanent place of residence. And the fourth message, and we agree with Mr. Tuka, this is the right to vote in election. So this is maybe a question to me. So about the public council, I know that you were active participants in this. So what was the result? As I remember, on the internet, you can get this information. This fight between the participants of this event, they just made a big fight among themselves, and this was the end of it. And about the right for compensation, I agree with you completely. Yes, I agree with you. Moreover, I do not support the argument that compensation should be demanded from the Russian Federation. This is logical, but Ukraine, as a state, it should care about its own citizens. And the state, first of all, should meet the needs of people and then demand compensation from Russia for all those terrible losses that our country sustains. So there is no contradiction. But unfortunately, I should say that our opinion won't be shared by the Ministry of Finance, as I said.
Thank you. We have one question, please, on the second row.
Валерий Кравченко.
Валерий Кравченко, IDP.
In Vinnytsia. I will be far from the declarations and would like to speak about this IDP problem and the lack of progress in IDP regulations. Actually, our state, Ukraine, doesn't know what to do, what we want to do with the IDPs. That's the main reason of our problems. Actually, we have two facing approaches regarding the IDPs. Now it's a full integration, and the minister and deputy minister Georgiy Tuka, he is fighting for this approach and full integration, and with all these benefits like affordable housing and like jobs and the right of vote and the right to be elected on these elections. And another approach is like a partial integration and preserving these opportunities for deoccupation and reintegration, using this IDPs like an influence group in the dialogue to the rest of the people which left on this occupied territories. So unfortunately, our state still doesn't know what the approach is more useful and how we can use these approaches, and that is my question, how to find this balance and how to use probably IDPs for the second approach, for the second role, by not discriminating them on the first role. Thank you.
I want to address this question both to Deputy Minister and the authors of report, if I may. Deputy Minister first, please.
Дякую. Знов практично до мене запитання.
This is the question for me. I agree that those people that are now IDPs, I would like to say from the very start that at I have a lot of close friends who are from Donbass. And I really do not care about the origin of people. I am from the sixth generation of Kievans, but when I was young, I stopped to ask people about their origin. I think this is not good. So I believe that all IDPs are different, and many times speaking with IDPs, I saw in some people this wish of revenge, to punish those who remain there, even their neighbors who didn't have arms in their hands, and they wanted to punish them because they were forced to flee. And there is another thing, when people who fled from war, saving lives of their children, their wife, they fled uncontrolled territories. They came to Ukraine and they didn't get from the state any support except mistrust, disillusion, and maybe, I won't lie, that they started to reject the state more, and then they went back to uncontrolled territory, and this is the big problem that was formed starting day one. Whether this problem is resolved, no. Whether I see the ways how to resolve it, yes. And recently we have had a dialogue about the crossing of the line of confrontation and whether we should continue to pay pensions. I believe that it is not correct to link the pension payments to IDP registration. I called to Stanice Luganska. They have 300,000 IDPs, but about 1,000 really reside there. And 44 people, they verify whether these people live there, and these workers of social service, they do not have any transport. In order to verify everyone, they should check 17 or 18 people in rural areas. So from the very start, when the state forms such a position, they create corruption in this. And we know that social workers, they were bribed at a local level. There are no convictions, but there are hearings ongoing on this matter. And we shouldn't hide our head in the sand, saying that this is the only thing how to solve it. So this was brought by ideology of the 18th century, and now we have different times, and we have real means such as electronic verification of the crossing of the line of confrontation. But people do not have proper understanding of this, and by these actions of the state, we form negative attitude of people towards state, including IDPs. And yesterday I came from work and I got the phone call, and the woman called me and she said that her daughter was registered as IDP. She has 3 children, and now she is a volunteer at the front line, saving our guys, and social workers came to her and said that if she won't come to them, they won't be provided with social benefits. And this is the state policy, and it is wrong and criminal, but there is no wish to change it.
of our time, but I want to a bit rephrase this the same question. I'm actually inspired to see
Я хочу
conversation happening between civil society and the government, and moreover that, again, there is agency in war-displaced people in Ukraine that are fighting for their rights, but they're also trying to provide ways to out of this situation, their formulas. But if we're looking into the experience of countries who went through the same, including in our region of Eastern Europe, is there anything that we can transport or any kind of experience you would point that is successful, and Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, and both Ukrainian civil society should look more closely into and copy something out of it?
I think probably the example I'll give is that, you know, the situations with IDPs is very fluid. From our discussions in Vinica, you may today decide that you want to remain in Vinica, but we actually had then young students who said, but in 10 years I may want to return. So the situation between return, resettlement is extremely fluid and can change year to year. And I think one of the most positive examples is to design and develop strategies around IDPs that always preserve that choice within that policy. So for example, with voting, that you retain your residence or you vote temporarily in the residence you're in, but you still maintain your IDP status. You can have both. Okay, you can be an IDP and you can vote in the place where you're at.
And we saw that in Georgia.
Yeah, and we saw that in Georgia. So that you're always maintaining both aspects of an IDP's choice within a policy decision. Another example might be around registering houses that have been left in the East, okay? That you are still maintaining ownership of those houses. They can't be bought and sold by other people that might be moving into them. So you're retaining that status even as you may be integrating in the West. You're still maintaining a place in both. And so these types of policies that allow for choice within those policies seem to be important.
We have for one quick question, right? If you keep it brief, please, for third row. Is it a question? Okay, great.
My question is to Ambassador Herbst, but maybe the entire panel. I was hoping that maybe you could give a suggestion to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in following up to what has now become public, that the Russian Federation is using its consulate in Ukraine to sell property in the non-government controlled territories. This is a direct follow-up on what you have just mentioned, that they have this property. What would the best action be, in your opinion, Ambassador Herbst?
And if I may add to this question, so we wrap it up on the whole discussion, I want to tap into Ambassador Herbst's diplomatic background. This is something that many Ukrainians reaching out all the time. When they're frustrated with the government on lack of problem resolving within the country, should they and how, with what effective message they should reach out to humanitarian organizations, and how do they, let's just say, sell this issue? How do they frame it right, that it's important and people in Europe or in the United States should pay more attention, including resource-wise?
Okay, regarding the question about staff at the Russian consulate selling property, I don't have many details on this. If it's as simple a problem as you've described, it would be quite appropriate for the Ukrainian government to declare any such officials persona non grata and send them packing. I believe that Ukraine has not done nearly enough in international courts to seek justice from Russia for the seizure of Crimea, the seizure of assets in Crimea, the seizure of assets in the occupied territories of Donbass. And this, of course, can be added to the list of particulars of Russian economic crimes, Kremlin economic crimes against Ukraine. regarding your question, I think that there are people in the United States, as well as in Ukraine and in other countries, who are not in their governments, who are trying to persuade their governments to pursue sensible policies on a whole variety of issues. And I certainly have fallen into that category regarding American foreign policy towards Ukraine, towards Russia, towards the whole post-Soviet space. I don't think there is a single answer to the question. I think that if you do feel strongly about a specific issue and believe the policies of your government needs to change, you should analyze the question very closely. You should seek meetings with your own government to help move your government directly in the right direction. You should be seeking support within your own society, different sources of influence to help persuade your government to pursue the right policies, and perhaps also seek support overseas for those same results. We know, for example, on core reform issues, that senior leadership in Ukraine needs persuasion from civil society, from the international financial institutions, and from friendly Western governments. And so, again, these are the choices you face as you seek to move your government to reason.
Thank you so much. I think we've done great bridge building here today, between our foreign allies and between the Ukrainian government and foreign allies, and between civil society and the Ukrainian government. I think that, unfortunately, we often hear that the Eastern Ukrainian war and Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Eastern Ukrainian front line is where the future of European continent, and at least security dimension, will be decided. But seeing the complexity of this problem and some challenges that Ukraine faces regarding war-displaced person are absolutely unique in our modern history. At the same time, the energy, the desire to tackle these issues, not shy away from extremely complicated, controversial issues, this is something you rarely see in other conflict places. And this is something that provides me with a lot, and I think all panelists will agree, with a lot of enthusiasm and also hope that not only the fate of Europe will be decided on that front line, but also the future of Ukraine will shine through the problem of resolving the problems of war-displaced people in Ukraine. Thank you so much for our panelists. Thank you so much for our audience and for questions and comments you have. And stay for more of this event from Atlantic Council. Thank you for Ukrainian Media Crisis Center for offering us this platform.